howdy, and welcome to the Strange West Podcast. This is your host and word hustler extraordinaire, Trentano. Bringing us in, as always, with their rendition of Eno Morricone's For a Few Dollars More, is the mighty Mitch Polzak and the Royal Deuces. If you like your guitar singers or you like your gunslingers, then head on over to MitchPolzak.com. That's Mitch, Polzak.com. And in tonight's podcast, the Cowboy versus Nazi action continues in Chapter 12 of Paris High Noon by yours truly, Trentano. You can pick up a copy today at parishighnoon.com, both paperback and ebook at parishighnoon.com. T-shirts and sweaters and other swag are available at society6.com/Trentano. Both Paris High Noon and the mustache logo is available at society6.com/Trentano. And always a big thank you to James K. Doyle for lending us his time and talent to the podcast. He really brings Paris High Noon alive. So without further ado, here is Chapter 12 of Paris High Noon.
Chapter 12, Greenbacks and Gunsmoke. Argentan sat like a granite mason in the light of the false dawn. The Église Saint-Germain crowned a small hill surrounded by a labyrinth of bocage farms and the thick Forêt de Gouffern. The Orne River slipped west down from the Collines de Pourchet and lapped at the stone banks on the other side. The Germans lollygagging in town were nothing but bean-counting shirkers who fought battles with typewriters and adding machines. A platoon of field gendarmes kept everyone in line, but for the most part they slacked about like cowboys around the chuck wagon. Catfish sat under an oak tree, looking down at the narrow streets and open cobblestone plazas of this sleepy little Norman town through a pair of binoculars he pinched during one of his scavenging trips. Hammer, Jacques, and St. Jude and Louis stood near the horses. Jean rode up from behind. "It's all set," he said, as he got off his horse. He had just checked in with Quick Billy and Barnaby at their positions. All night they rode through the forest, ducking a stray patrol here and there, but Catfish made good time, allowing Jean, Patrice, Quick Billy, and Barnaby to plant scores of bundled dynamite all around the northern outskirts of town and wired them to a series of plungers. "Let's hope the Luftwaffe will be on time," St. Jude said. "Damn Boche run everything by the clock," Hammer said. "They even got their cocks hard at the top of the hour so they can suck each other off." The gang let out a nervous laugh. They left Tours and Lemore with only half the provisions they would need for the trail, and with the Nazi posse already on the hunt, it made for a desperate situation if they didn't get a big score. Catfish rode down the line and gave each man a bandana. "Can't go robbing a bank without one," he said. "Wouldn't be proper." "Where did you get these?" Hammer said. "One of my trips to town." They weren't real bandanas, at least not the kind Catfish used back in the Wild West. They were large squares cut out of a sheet Catfish found drying on a line. The small printed flowers on every square inch didn't exactly inspire terror. "If we put these things on, the Boche will laugh themselves to death," Louis said. "Better than giving them a good look at your mug," said St. Jude. "We could just kill the bastards," Jacques said. "I've got no love for the Boche, that's for sure," Catfish said. "But this is a bank robbery, not a massacre. Just control them, scare them a little." "People scare easier while they're dying," Jacques said. "You kill anyone that don't deserve it, and I'll gun you down," Catfish replied. His cobalt eyes began to harden at the edges, and Jacques backed off. The hum of planes sounded in the distance. "Everybody knows what to do?" Catfish asked for the last time. Everyone nodded. Catfish had kept the plan as simple as possible to allow for the inevitable shit hitting the fan. "Well," he said, "let's see what kind of bandits we are." Another routine day was about to set in for both occupier and occupied. The Germans let the citizens of Argentan go about their business as if the Nazi blood banner flying over the town square was the tricolor of the Republic. The townspeople had escaped the fires of war, and for that they were grateful. Freedom seemed a small price to pay for their lives, and so each day they grew more accustomed to life under the jackboot. The explosions rocked the northwest edges of Argenton just as the Luftwaffe bomber formation approached the edge of town. Sleepy-eyed soldiers spilled out of houses and hotels, half-dressed like drunken ants charging a picnic, jumping for cover while the klaxon filled the air with its banshee wail. Civilians, so used to the silence of the occupation, ran down into their basements and root cellars. Soon, the heavy rat-a-tat-tat of anti-aircraft fire replaced the din of dynamite. The guns pounded the red dawn, filling it with flashes and small black puffs. All eyes were either shut up as tight as a frog's butthole or looking at the explosions in the sky. No one, soldier or civilian, seemed to notice that 7 horsemen riding slowly up the narrow, meandering streets. The violent explosions muted the clip-clop of iron horseshoes on cobblestone. The gang made their way up the streets to the center of town, where they dismounted near the back of the church next to the bank. St. Jude went ahead with his machine gun tucked underneath a raincoat. Across the square, dozens of soldiers ran about from one building to another shouting and yelling, while those on the guns continued to pepper their own planes with flak. "The Boche are still running around like chickens with their heads cut off," St. Jude said. "Well, that's what we want," Catfish said. They had about 10 more minutes before Barnaby and Quick Billy hit the last series. Catfish had to blow the safe while the Germans' attention was still on the sky. The men tied the horses near the church alcove, leaving Patrice to watch over them. They headed for the back of the bank where the door was slightly ajar. Catfish pulled out the peacemaker and looked at the outlaws. "All right, boys, here we go." A few soldiers who pulled night guard were looking out the front windows of the confused action in the plaza. Before they knew what was happening, masked men had pointed their guns at them. The officer in charge started shouting at the outlaws. Hammer hit him with a heavy right, and he fell to the floor. The rest of the young soldiers threw up their hands. "Get up against the wall, you maggots," Hammer yelled, and pushed the guards' sheet-white cheeks to the concrete. St. Jude yelled to Jean, "Keep an eye on the front." The large, elegant plate glass windows with the iron bars stamped on the wall made the front of the bank look like a cross between the Ritz and Devil's Island. Jean looked out the window and saw confused soldiers running around the square. There was a lull in the explosions, and the anti-aircraft gunners stopped their firing as the officers tried to get control of the situation. "Looks like the panic is over," Jean said. The old cowboy didn't pay much attention to what Jean was saying. Across the marble counters and gilded wire that separated the tellers from the customers, the bank's safe sat like a steel titan. "So, can you blow it?" St. Jude said. Catfish grinned. "Only one way to find out." Another round of explosions rocked Argenton's outskirts, throwing the Germans into a confused state once again. "That's the last of it," Hammer said. "God-damn peasant," St. Jude yelled. "Barnaby blew the last ones too early." "Well, we can't change that now," Catfish said. He took out 2 sticks of dynamite and tied them to the lock face, then tied more to the hinges. Looking at the thick door, Catfish decided a few more sticks wouldn't hurt and threw them underneath. "That going to be enough?" St. Jude asked. "Any more and I'll blow up the whole bank." "Try not to be too ambitious," St. Jude said with a nervous smile. "This is the first bank job for some of us, and we don't want it to be our last." Catfish tied the fuses together and told everyone to find cover. Jean ran for the thickest pillar he could crouch behind, while Louis and Jacques jumped over a marble counter. Hammer threw over a heavy mahogany desk and then shoved the gawking soldiers behind it. The old cowboy struck a match on the seat of his pants and then touched off the fuse. Outside, the track-mounted 37mm flak guns pounded away at the sky. A few Luftwaffe bombers even crashed to the ground. Wehrmacht officers wondered why the bombs were dropped at the edge of town. Disparaging comments about the RAF bomber crews were being made when a blast shook the town square. The bank's plate glass and iron bar windows blew out as if it was trying to hold in a twister. Soldiers were sliced and impaled by the flying debris. Again, the gunners panicked and fired into the air at the last of the Luftwaffe bombers. The blast shook the church. Putting horses in a panic, they tried to break out from the little alcove, but Patrice was able to keep them in. Now he ran for the bank, thinking only of his pard, Jean, afraid that he had crossed the Jordan. For a moment, nothing stirred in the lobby, save for drifting dust. Christ almighty, put a bullet in me, Jacques groaned from underneath the marble teller stations. Although the stone protected him from the flying debris, he was still thrown against the wall. Other groans could be heard as clumps of wood, plaster, glass, and metal stirred to reveal human forms. Even with their hands covering their ears, their heads rang as if a church bell tolled between their temples. Jean slowly got up from the floor. Although the stone pillar protected him, he was still blown across the lobby and landed hard on the marble floor. My God, Patrice shouted from the back door. He ran over to help Jean up. Are you okay? Jean shook his head. I will be when I stop seeing two of you. God damn, St. Jude said, dusting himself off. Think you used enough dynamite? Catfish dusted himself off. Well, I guess I overestimated myself. Wouldn't be the first time. Where's the safe? Jean said, looking at the big, smoking hole where it used to be. What happened at the Argenton Bank was what Professor Brown explained to Catfish after Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch robbed the Union Pacific Overland Flyer outside of Wilcox, Wyoming. Physics. When large amounts of force are used to move an object of heavy mass, things tend to happen that one might not think could. Catfish's liberal use of TNT caused the safe to pop up like a Mexican jumping bean and at the same time crack the floor underneath. When the safe came crashing down on the cracked stone floor, it broke right through to the basement. St. Jude flopped down on his belly to look at the safe, which lay on its side with the door peeled like a half-open tin of sardines. Now what? He said. Catfish scratched his head. It was his fault for overemphasizing his mastery of explosives. Catfish turned to Hammer. Take Patrice and Louis and grab the horses. Then he turned to Jacques and gave an order he would soon regret. Cover the guards. The three bandits ran outside to bring the mounts, while Jacques looked on at the four guards, who were dazed with blood trickling out of their ears. Their eyes were wide and unblinking. Their mouths made horrible sounds. A few were able to raise their arms up in submission, while the others just stared at Jacques. The soldiers outside had stopped firing. An eerie calm settled along the streets and rooftops of Argenton. Officers and senior sergeants shouted orders. After reducing the mad panic to a level of curious confusion, they surveyed the damage. The bank looked a total loss, although the main door held, as did most of the iron bar window cages. A few soldiers prayed silently, since it seemed impossible that anyone could have survived that awesome blast. Then someone screamed from inside. Jacques had knifed one of the soldiers. The young soldier tried to say something, but it was all Teutonic gibberish to Jacques. Murder was building up in him, and he could taste the bile in the back of his throat. Jacques pulled out the bayonet. The heavy blade cut into the side of the soldier's neck near the base of the skull, and he went down. Jacques brought the blade up again and jumped on the bleeding soldier's chest, stabbing with a manic fury. The rest of the guards scrambled up and stumbled for the door, screaming for help. The screams got the attention of Catfish and St. Jude. They turned to see Jacques get up from one butchered body and pounce on another soldier. slashing and hacking at his neck and shoulders. Catfish pulled his .45 and shot the soldier closest to the door, while St. Jude let loose a burst from his submachine gun on the second. All 4 guards were dead or dying, their comrades outside now focused on the gray stone bank. Catfish turned the peacemaker on Jacques, who stood over his second carcass. Outside, a stampede of jackboots on cobblestone swirled around the center of town. The 2 men stared at each other, one with a bloody bayonet, the other with a smoking gun. "They're coming," Jean said. "What do we do?" St. Jude asked. "Stall them," Catfish said. "How?" "Do I have to do all the thinking in this bunch?" Catfish threw a stick of dynamite at St. Jude. "See if this won't scare him away." A captain crept up closer to the bank with a Luger in his hand. His men followed slowly behind. Suddenly, a smoking stick of dynamite fell at his feet. The officer screamed and turned to run. His men quickly followed his lead, jumping behind sandbags and anything handy. The blast tossed the captain in the air. He landed hard on the cobblestone square. The remaining soldiers fired everything they had at the bank. Hammer, Louis, and Patrice came in with the horses, which shied and tried to turn as the bullets ricocheted inside the stone building. Catfish yelled at Patrice to throw a rope. The old cowboy tied one end of the rope to the closest stone column next to the hole and fashioned a harness at the other. "Come here," Catfish said to Jean. "You're not going to hang the kid," Hammer said. "No, I'm going to plumb him down the hole," Catfish replied, then looked at Jean. "Grab what you can, son, and heave him up. Patrice, Jacques, and Louis, tie the loot to the horses. St. Jude and Hammer, cover the back." Between spurts of machine gun fire, the soldiers moved around the open square and through the tight streets towards the back of the bank. St. Jude and Hammer ran towards the back alley behind the bank. They held themselves up in doorways opposite each other. Sweat poured from their brows and stung their eyes. Submachine guns rested against their heaving chests. "Looks like we got a chance to make up for Leon," St. Jude said. "I ran because I didn't want to die," Hammer said. "I guess we would have been better off taking our hanging." Hammer smiled. "Would have saved us the trouble of living rough for the past couple of weeks." The seconds stretched like hours while the wind blew gently down the small back street. The sound of glass breaking under jackboots echoed against the buildings. They were coming hard and fast. St. Jude looked over at Hammer, and the 2 men nodded. They stepped out of the doorway and opened fire. "Eat shit, you turds," St. Jude screamed. The MP-40 chewed through the magazine. St. Jude dropped the empty magazine onto the cobblestones and slammed in a fresh one within seconds. Both bandits fired and reloaded till the barrels glowed. Bullets ricocheted against the stone buildings. Those in front didn't have a chance, and those behind didn't fare much better. St. Jude reached for a stick of dynamite stuck in his pocket, but he was so jittery from the gunfight that it stumbled from his fingers. Hammer looked down at the dynamite and then at St. Jude, shaking his head. He slapped in a fresh magazine, sucked in a deep breath, and stepped into the whirlwind. Bullets cracked around him as Hammer put his weight into the bucking gun. St. Jude reached down and grabbed the stick of dynamite. He struck the match with his thumb, touched off the fuse, and threw the stick at the Germans. Both outlaws hugged the doorway as the dynamite went off, shaking the small alleyway and shattering the windows. Hammer fired off the rest of the magazine. Then he and St. Jude ran back to the bank. The soldiers fell backwards towards the square to regroup and make another go of it. They hadn't lost a battle yet and didn't want to lose today. Back at the bank, Jacques, Louis, and Patrice had a fireman line going from the hole where Jean was tossing up whatever bags he could get. Much of the loot had shifted away from the half-peeled door. Jean had to stretch his arms and feel his way around with his hands to grab the bags from inside. The machine gun and rifle fire slacked and then stopped. Hammer looked outside. An armored half-track with a 37mm anti-aircraft cannon rolled towards the edge of the square. "Hurry up," Hammer screamed. "Something big is coming." The half-track stopped. The lieutenant poked his head out from a pile of sandbags and pointed at the bank. The cannon's barrel moved slowly and surely until it was in line with the heavy iron door. "Duck!" St. Jude yelled. The chug-chug of the autocannon sounded like a steam engine slamming into the bank. Its shell smashed down the door and hammered chunks of stone the size of melons from the granite walls. One shell tore into St. Jude's horse, blowing blood and entrails onto the rest of the remuda. The horses reared up and flailed their hooves at anyone trying to grab their reins. "Catfish," St. Jude shouted. "We need your help." Catfish told Patrice to pull Jean out of the hole and rushed over to the horses. He took a torn swatch of curtain and threw it over one of the pack horse's eyes. The animal calmed down enough for the old cowboy to take the reins. The rest of the gang followed his example and guided the horses away from the heavy shelling and back towards the church alcove. Catfish rushed to the window and took aim at the soldier on top of the half-track while he was feeding the 5-round clips of ammo into the hungry chamber. Catfish rested the Colt on his left arm and took aim. The shot knocked the loader down, and for a moment all was quiet. "Let's get while the getting's good," Catfish said. He looked at Patrice, who was trying to pull Jean out of the hole. "Hurry up, you two." Jean climbed hand over hand up the rope until he reached the edge of the blown-out concrete. Patrice reached out his hand as Jean tried to scramble up and over. Jean looked up at Patrice, and the pars smiled at each other. The big gun started up again. The chug-chug of the auto-cannon rained hard on the bank. Then Patrice was gone, and the rope slacked. Jean fell back down into the basement. His eyes were wide open as Patrice vaporized into a cloud of pink. Blood and flesh rained down on him. His tongue tasted iron, and bile burned the back of his throat. "Patrice!" Jean screamed. Catfish ran over and grabbed the rope, but it was slick with what was left of Patrice. St. Jude rushed over and helped. His hands moved over each other, pulling what seemed like inches, until he could see his little brother's wide, white eyes. St. Jude and Catfish hauled Jean up and pushed him towards the back door. Jean looked at Catfish for an explanation, but there was no time. "We gotta go," Catfish said. Jean didn't move. St. Jude grabbed him by his coat and dragged him outside. Jean took one last look at the bank, trying to find just a small piece of his friend. But there were only chunks of stone and flesh. Hammer threw a few more sticks of TNT at the half-track, sending up a cloud of smoke and debris to cover their escape. They rode hard out of town, their horses struggling to keep their footing on the slick cobblestone. Bullets zipped past them. The cracks from the rifles and the roar of the machine guns echoed off the town walls. The horses were scared out of their minds, yet they followed the Black Arabian through the corkscrew streets that meandered down to the grassy fields of the Orne Valley. Barnaby and Quick Billy sat on their mounts holding the reins of the pack horses, watching the rest of the gang ride hell for leather towards them. Quick Billy wondered why they were riding so hard until a panzer appeared out of nowhere like a grizzly standing up in the tall grass. Without comment, the two turned their horses and put them to spur. By the time the Wehrmacht were able to move their big tanks and armored vehicles out of town towards the open plain, the mounted bandits galloped across the grassy fields and disappeared into the thick Forêt du Gaffern. The outlaws rode southeast along the Collines de Pourchet until they reached the headwaters of the Sarthe and rode the river to cover their tracks. Catfish led them down the Sarthe Valley before heading back north and then west along the Collines de Normandy, then doglegging southwest into the high hills of the Alpes Marseille. Once in the rugged hills, the riders dismounted to save the horses from ruin and exhaustion. They took the reins and pulled their mounts along the steep cliffs and deep gorges. Once they entered a thicket of brush, bramble, and hardwood trees, Catfish called a halt. The exhausted men took off the saddles and started to rub down their horses. St. Jude and Hammer broke out a few bottles of wine. Jacques had his back turned when Catfish called him out. "You knew this was coming, you son of a bitch," the old cowboy said. The peacemaker hung low on his hip. His right hand hovered steady over the butt. The rest of the gang walked away from the two outlaws. When Jacques killed the guards in the bank, they all wanted him dead. They still wanted him dead, just not in this place and time. "You'd risk a shot with the Boche after us?" Jacques asked. "You risked our lives," Catfish retorted. Jacques appraised the situation. His submachine gun was strapped across his back, useless, although the bayonet was tucked in his belt within easy reach. Still, you didn't have to be a fortune teller to predict the outcome. "I've got no chance against you," Jacques said. "I'm giving you the same chance as you gave everyone else you've murdered." "God damn it to hell." Jacques went for the bayonet. The report of the peacemaker echoed across the valley and then died out. The gang mounted their horses, leaving the smell of blood and gunpowder hanging in the air of the small grove.
And welcome back to the Strange West podcast. This is your host and word hustler extraordinaire, Trent Tano. Well, thank you for tuning in to Chapter 12 of Paris High Noon by yours truly, Trent Tano. You can pick up a copy today at parishighnoon.com. Can't wait to find out what happens next? Then go to parishighnoon.com where you can download an ebook or purchase a paperback. Paris High Noon t-shirts and other swag are available at society6.com/Trentano. Both Paris High Noon and the mustache is available at society6.com/Trentano. And another big thank you to James K. Doyle for lending us his time and his talent to the podcast. And taking us out, as always, with their rendition of Eno Morricone's For a Few Dollars More is the mighty Mitch Polzak and the Royal Deuces. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time. Happy trails.